Well, hello and welcome back to TTT, Tidy Tea Time. This is Team Tidy. We meet up over tea and we talk about all things work. Now, right off the bat, before we get in, I just wanted to say that our topic today is a generalization, right? It is not fair to assume that all employees hate HR. It's a very strong sentiment. That said, we do think it's important to talk about why a lot of people tend to perceive HR in a negative way. And I think that's what we are going to try and get into today. Also, a quick note, the reason we kind of came up with this topic is because, as Tidy, we are a product that has been built for HR and people teams, right? We are built to make work better for them so that they can work smarter, faster, and better. But in the course of our work we do talk to a lot of HR folk, and one thing that keeps coming out again and again is how lonely they really are. And that's what kind of made us wonder, like, why is it that way? Why is HR always separate from the rest of the company, looked at as a separate entity? Um so with that, I'll open it up to you, Pooja and Kiran. From your personal experience, I know right now today we work very closely with HR folk. But before that, what did you think about your HR teams and HR departments?
Well, I personally haven't actually I've always worked with smaller teams, so I actually haven't had one on ones with HR folk at all in the past. Actually, it's only this organization where I've really been introduced to the idea of HR and what they contribute to the company. So, in terms of past experience, I actually don't have much of that.
Kiran?
Well, I have a lot of experience, um, but I think it's a mixed bag. There have been times when, as a manager or as an employee reporting to someone else, there have been frustrations. But I think the problem is a misunderstood frustration to a large extent, right? Where you're blaming HR because fundamentally, unfortunately, in most organizations I have seen, um, you have HR who's burdened with anything that's to do with an employee and any process that even remotely touches the employee. It may be an IT problem, but
Hmm.
HR kind of gets pulled in the front, gets pulled in front for, making sure it's solved. And so it kind of gets a bad rap because that's the problem. There's a lot of admin work, there's a lot of paper pushing that HR does, which kind of causes delays for processes. And um, I think for one, to be very, very candid, am also not the biggest fan of a lot of documentation. So when you are a manager, there's a ton of documentation that you are expected to produce as a manager for your team, for your organization as a whole. So I think that's been my experience.
Yeah, so imagine you as a manager hate paperwork. Imagine HR's job, right? Can we all admit here that HR, their work is not easy? Can we all admit? Or do
Hmm.
we feel
Yeah.
differently about that?
Yeah.
No, it's not easy at all. Is it the
Yeah.
right job being given to them? I think not,
Yeah.
but it's not easy what they are burdened with.
Yeah. Yeah. In fact, there is so, I mean, I think HR first came to be, right, during the Industrial Revolution, when there were so many changes in the workplace. There's so many things that were wrong in the workplace, right? When people had to put in policies in place to ensure that okay, of course, it started off as a productivity thing, ensuring everyone adhered to the rules, adhered to policies that were put in place, because otherwise there were major compliance issues that a lot of companies had to face, which is still the case today. But HR's role was primarily to make sure that they kept an eye on the employees and made sure that no, they everyone towed the line. Um, and therefore, they came to be known as the policy police, right, at that time. And I think that tagline still stays with them today. Do we? It was a thought I had while we were talking about thinking about this one thing, is that we talk about culture so much, right, and how important culture is. It's that fabric that holds every one of us together. But It almost feels like, people will say that culture flows from leadership, but policies flow from HR. Isn't that unfair?
I mean, I don't know who says that, but unless that's an assumption
It's an
that
assumption.
most people have,
Yeah.
um, I think the reason for that is again the fact that when you kind of again peel the onion, you see that HR is burdened with all the work that unfortunately may not be their core competence.
Mm.
Right? At the end of the day, I think when you look at the core of what a people team should be doing is supporting people to get productive faster, to be more productive, make their lives better, whatever it is, to kind of uplift that entire experience, right? But when you think about policy police, you're thinking about paperwork, administrative work, operations, which may be a small fraction of what is expected from an ideal scenario, but it suddenly takes over in most organizations. And what I have seen is that in most organizations, the HR is, as I was saying earlier, the one who is called in whenever there's an employee problem. That employee
Yeah.
problem could be a laptop that's missing or not available for a new hire, or it could be, someone who has a serious problem with leadership and with the managers that they work with. Now, in the first case, a laptop not being available is technically not an HR problem at the core of it, right? And fundamentally, that's where I think many companies are now moving into people ops, which is saying that anyone who touches the people experience has to be a owner, co-owner of that entire experience. So it's not just HR, it's finance, it's IT, it's operations, admin, whoever it is, have to kind of come together to build that experience. I
Yeah.
think till now HR has kind of got that rap sheet because they have been seen as that one layer which has to do with everything employee. And I think that's the fundamental problem.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, and also I think it's that has changed though, right? Because
I'm not
we
seeing
can't.
that much of a change. I actually don't see that change
No,
as much. No, not at all. I think there's a long way to go. It's like probably not even in its infancy. It's probably in its seed stage.
I don't know. I think I do feel there's been a lot of change ever since the pandemic, because I think a lot of that focus and spotlight went on HR and how they were dealing with everything, right? At the end of the
But think
day,
about it. It was again, oh shit, we have now got to send laptops to people to their homes. We now
yeah,
have to make sure people can log in from wherever they are. Now we need to run events online so that people come and sit on a Zoom call and suddenly feel all inspired.
yeah.
No, that unfortunately does not work, right? And none of those are core of what HR was built or expected to do, at least not from the ideal state of what HR should be.
So, I mean, I think to some extent there's, you're right, because HR was suddenly expected to carry the burden of actually making the whole organization work, right, at all, because the pandemic threw everything out the window. And they did rise up to it though, but it almost felt like HR had to do that job that nobody else wanted to do, so they learned. And then suddenly, therefore, because of the pandemic and the spotlighting of that job role that is not, as easy as everyone assumed it was, you have, such an increase in the amount of money that is, or the budgets that are being assigned to HR, for example, now, right? A lot more, of course. That's a whole new topic wherein a lot of money is being spent on helping HR get, automate their tasks. For example, what you were saying, right? Paper pushing, all of those things. Automation has become like this big buzzword wherein people are like, okay, we can't do things the way we used to do it before. So a lot more money is being spent now. HR tech budgets are going up, but is it still keeping HR in that place of, oh God, I don't know what HR does, or HR's work is irrelevant? I think that's changing, right? Because you still need those people who, and the amount of importance that we're now putting on keeping talent happy, and talent and retaining talent. in the workplace. That also falls on HR. Yes, on managers, but largely HR is driving that, isn't it?
I think the problem is that sorry, Pooja, if you want to go for it. I'll wait for you.
No, no, no. Continue.
Okay.
I will add on when I'm ready.
I think the problem is during the pandemic, the HR office became crisis management office. It could have
Yeah.
been renamed that. It could have been completely renamed that, and you wouldn't know the difference, right? You could have had every single HR exec become a crisis management exec, and it's not a problem. It would have still made sense from a
Mm,
hierarchy, organizational structure perspective, whatever it is. That's what they were doing, right? And HR has traditionally been very good at that. So people who kind of become HR professionals are also known to be good crisis managers, not buckle under pressure, have a stable head, and so on and so forth. Um, but I think, unfortunately, the problem is that does not elevate HR.
mm,
And it still has not elevated HR. We all say, HR has got a seat at the board now after the pandemic, at the board table. But in reality, they haven't. Because if you were to really have an HR team that is doing everything it should be doing, then that team should be kind of reimagining the entire, I would go to the extent of saying the workplace stack, right?
mm.
So what should offices look like? What should systems look like? What should, benefits look like? What should everything look like? Not just one small part of it, which is policies, benefits, and, something else. But the
Yeah.
entire experience needs to be reimagined by HR, but they're not there. And I don't think the HR function is even close to being there with any organization, right? So it is still a long way off from being ideal. And unfortunately, as long as they're stuck in this kind of space where it's not the ideal HR team, there will always be frustration against that HR team because they are trying to play catch up. They're trying to play catch up and trying to manage and cope with whatever is thrown their way and make sure that everything is done, which unfortunately is a terrible place to be at.
Yeah.
None of us would like to be there, ideally.
Yeah. Pooja, what's your take?
I guess because a lot of people mistake, and again, this is an assumption, but a lot of people mistake HR, the existence of HR is more to, or purely to benefit the company rather than individual people, right? So, am I right in saying that, or am I,
Yeah,
uh,
lots of people think that HR represents the company and
right?
speaks for the company rather than
Yeah,
speaking for people,
y-
unfortunately.
yeah. So that said, if you're going to go to HR for every, like, for crisis management, then how much can the HR do? At the end of the day, the power lies with the leadership, right? I mean, whether we like it or not, it isn't the HR that is going to make the final decisions. It is the HR that is going to then figure out how to deal with it with higher ups and then tackle the situation accordingly. So HR being put in that position itself is quite makes their job so difficult and so
Yeah,
hard to
and that's
manage.
because they're that one kind of cost
Yeah,
function. It's that as a cost function rather than an investment or an asset or any of that, right? And
yeah,
unfortunately, I think that plays to what you were saying. They are kind of like toothless from that perspective because they always have to go back and get someone else to maybe sponsor a budget or part of a budget or whatever it may be. I think the unfortunate reality is because no one has really understood what HR's true value is, right? And as
yeah,
I said, they are always there to manage any sort of sudden issue that arises as long as it has to do with the employee side. Anything on the customer side, they don't have anything to touch with. But as long
yeah,
as it's on the employee side of the world, they have to kind of figure it out, whatever it may be.
Yeah.
yeah,
I think what you said, Pooja, is exactly it, and you too, Kiran, is that the power lies with someone else. HR is
yeah,
just there as a front almost in a lot of cases, which is I think that a big part of the problem is there. By making HR toothless, then what is going to happen is, you said, budgets will not be assigned to you, because they're like, okay, you have to fight for every penny that comes your way. You have to prove why, you have to make a case for why you need that money spent. And very rarely, unfortunately, in HR, the ROI is very difficult to prove, right? Because it's to do with people, it's to do with productivity. We still don't have a good enough measure for productivity, right? I think that's the million-dollar question. How do you really judge productivity? You don't have one for, I mean, yeah, you can use attrition as one marker, but then attrition can be attributed to so many different things. And again, how does HR take credit or take flack for attrition numbers being good or bad, right? Then there are so many other things. And for example, during the pandemic, again, which was horrifying for me, at least I thought, was where people started using tracking software for employees, right? Again, to prove that, yeah, people are working. And someone came up with this idea, and that also would be attributed to an HR person saying, let's start tracking how productive our employees are being in their during their workday. Thankfully, I think that trend is dying a little bit, if I'm not mistaken. I'm not sure. But all of these things are then HR um, trying to almost follow instructions coming from leadership, and then being the face of them, of these ideas that come from leadership. And they what is sad is to see that that image continues to mar what they actually do. Because at the end of the day, we are suddenly talking about valuing softer things like empathy in the workplace, softer things like helping people belong, for example. All of these things squarely lie, sure, they lie with managers to some extent, but they lie with HR as well, right? And that, unfortunately, cannot give you, you can't put a dollar value to it, right? Do you think that's the reason it is as bad as it
I mean,
is?
maybe the answer lies in probably answering why employees, or what can you do for employees to love HR, right?
Hmm.
If we're saying employees love to hate HR, and during my early years in my career, I hated HR, right? Because as I said, it was always seen as an unnecessary process in getting anything completed. As I started kind of building my career and then becoming a manager and everything, I started appreciating things a lot more. But that's the problem when you don't understand how the dynamics of an organization work, and here's a team who's trying to make sure everything is coming together. How do you get employees to love HR? And
Yeah.
maybe that is the $1 million question.
Maybe
Maybe
we
a
start
billion
with,
dollar question,
yeah,
not just million. Yeah.
maybe we start with, something again soft, but which I think has a lot of value right now, is building trust in HR, right? Because would you, okay, like, create a scenario here, right? Tomorrow, if you have some issue with your work, with the way you're feeling at work, with maybe an incident at work, whatever it might be, will you go to HR first, or will you talk to a friend or a colleague or a manager? Who will you go to? Who's your first port of call?
I mean, in my
Uh,
current situation, it's a moot point.
Yeah.
But
No, so imagine you're in as an employee.
I
Would
mean,
you
it
go to
would
HR?
be that I would trust, which would probably most ideally be a friend or
Hmm.
some. It wouldn't be HR. No.
would it be a work friend or an external friend? What if you had to speak to someone at work because of his context?
Again, it's the trust thing that Debbie was saying. So if I don't, it depends on the situation. If it's an incident, if it's something along the lines of harassment or something,
Yeah.
then
Sure.
definitely somebody I absolutely trust. But if it's just something smaller than that, something more minor, then I wouldn't mind confiding in a
Yeah,
work
of
friend.
course.
Again,
But
not
again, you are now talking about managing a crisis. You talked about harassment, and no one wants to touch that,
yeah.
right? No one wants to get involved, but then HR has to because no one else
Yeah.
wants to get involved. Exactly that, right? And they're good at that crisis management piece, and
Mhm.
so they kind of come in. So the problem is, it's not. I mean, I'm hoping it's not a day to day. issue where you will need that HR support in a day-to-day scenario. How could you learn to love HR?
I think HR has as an employee, how could you love to learn HR? I think I have never had a problem with loving HR, by the way. Just putting it out there. I have always felt that the HR has a role, especially in large organizations. In smaller organizations, I think, it's because that HR function, and I say function, not the job, because, there are so many things that fall under the gamut of HR, which we do in smaller organizations. Like, for example, writing a JD, hiring, running interviews, speaking to teammates about productivity, whatever it is. All of these are actually HR functions, so we all play those roles. But as you work in bigger and bigger organizations, I feel like you do need that group of people who are keeping an eye on what is happening on the inside, while your so-called revenue teams, your sales, your biz dev, your marketing, your finance, your IT, all of these guys working together to let the company grow from the outside. HR is ensuring the health from the inside, health of the organization is good from the inside, right? I think therefore I have
But again,
always
you've used a lot of fancy words. Health of the organization. What does that mean? And writing a JD that you talked about
Mhm.
is something ChatGPT is going to do now,
I was
right?
going to come to that. I was going to
So,
come to that.
so where is the value again? So if I were to push you to say, how could you show value? How could you show value that HR is providing?
Simple thing.
Health of the company means nothing to an employee. Health of the employee experience or health of an employee means nothing to an employee,
And that
right?
is the sad part, right? And that is where HR struggles. And you're right. Absolutely. You're right. But it's difficult then to put, more substantive words to describe it. Because, and let me try in this case, right? A simple thing like the experiment that's been running in the US and the UK about a 4-day work week, right? This is something HR will drive within the organization. Right? Because if you experiment with different ways of working, maybe what you're doing is helping your employees do better work, be in a better place mentally. Because at the end of the day, we are not machines, we're human beings. And that's what HR is doing, right? They're in the business of dealing with humans, ensuring human beings have a good, positive workplace where they can be their best, right? Whether that is through the use of technology, whether that is through the use of putting new benefits in place, whether that's through the use of revisiting policies that are not working anymore, right? All of these things contribute to the health of an organization at the end of the day. How is it running from the inside? How seamless? How smooth? How many, speaking of paperwork, how much documentation? How many hoops do you have to jump through to get things done? All of these things, I mean, HR becomes the guardian of, and also therefore that group of people that can change things for the better, right?
Is any of this quantifiable?
And therein lies the problem. That's where I started. How do you
So then
quantify
maybe,
productivity?
if you look at it in an organization, you have marketing, who's responsible for leads. You have
Mm,
sales, who's responsible for revenue. You have finance, who's responsible for cost optimization. You have, engineering, who's responsible for product uptime and product development. You have XYZ, whatever it is. So what is it? What is that one statement, one liner, maybe two words that HR is responsible for? The moment you say employee experience, no one knows what that is.
mm.
So, what is
Yeah,
maybe what is that?
I think HR is the glue that holds a team together. It should be in an ideal case, okay? It should be. It
What
should.
does that mean?
Yeah.
I think the problem is anything you use to describe HR at this point is very qualitative, is very, and unfortunately, across websites, maybe we're guilty of this as well. Across content, you're always talking about these high, fruity kind of words when it comes to HR, right? And there's nothing that really kind of gets to the nitty gritty of HR, like in sales. And the only reason I'm bringing up sales is because that's what I've done for the last gazillion years. If you're talking about revenue, okay, how can you increase revenue? There's a sales guy who's getting the leads, doing demos, but then not closing at the point of contract. That means, or at the point of procurement. So that means he's terrible at negotiations potentially. then you know what needs to be done. In HR's case, I think that's the fundamental problem most people have, and I had during the initial years as well. And even today, I don't know how to explain it. But how do you explain that?
You can. I think there are ways in which to do it. For example, let's talk about onboarding itself, right? We keep talking about how, say, I think that it's 65% or 70% of new hires, for example, quit a company if they weren't within the first year of joining, if their onboarding wasn't done well, right? Again, that lies with HR to a large extent, so they can show that value, right? They can
But
show that value, but
we say, and I keep saying this, is that onboarding is not an HR problem. That's the
sure.
misunderstanding, right? They are burdened with it as the front. But if my laptop is not available on time, it's not an HR problem. If my badge and my ID is not available on time, it may not be an HR problem. It's IT systems, it's admin, it's finance. My payroll is not set up. That may be because there was an issue with the payroll vendor, right? So
I
again,
agree completely. So then that is the thing. HR is not a function that exists by itself. And unfortunately, we started off with that, with all HR people saying that we feel very lonely, right? And then we are saying today, you're saying right now, that all of these things are not HR problems alone. You are absolutely right. Productivity is not an HR problem alone. Attrition is not an HR problem alone. Poor onboarding, candidate experience, employee experience, none of these things can be put at HR's doorstep alone. And yet, HR is expected to do all of this by themselves. And that is the problem. So, HR, and that again, whenever you have any project, like in project management, you'll always have a lead. Right, you always have one person who keeps an eye on everything, make sure all the balls are in the air at all times, and
that's a
nothing falls.
project manager.
Yes, that's a project manager. So when it comes to the working of the running of the workplace, HR in a way becomes like that project manager who's ensuring that IT's in place, payroll happens on time, background checks happen on time, the employees getting swag, employees being connected to the buddy, employees being connected to mentors, a career path has been charted out. Let's If you did not have that HR person there who's keeping an eye on all of this, we put managers in charge and let's see how well that goes.
So they are
I don't think it'll
responsible
work.
for, like sales is responsible for revenue, HR is responsible for collaboration.
Yeah, that's one way
Yeah.
of putting it. Why not? I think there's a lot more to it, but collaboration is a good word for starters, right? Of bringing everything together and making sure things work, right? The beating heart of the organization. You can, again, like I said, I started off with that whole thing about culture. Culture is all about leadership, top down. Yeah, it's all about how leaders speak about each other, about how things are done in the workplace, respect and belonging. But HR, unfortunately, is looked at saying that, oh, you are part of the stuff that nobody else wants to do. But I think a large part of the culture is also can be driven by HR and is in a lot of these large organizations where it's difficult to keep an eye on that one thing, right? It's really difficult. For example, the CEO, it's tough for you to keep an eye on revenue as well, is keep an eye on your people as well, keep an eye on, other your partners, your sponsors, your everything else. There's so many factors that go into running an organization, this.
Investors, not sponsors.
And investors, yes, sorry, not sponsors, investors, right? So it's tough, and you
Yeah.
need that person. Like, we hired our HR person as well as a company because we are growing, and we're growing really fast, and you need that person who can you can hold it together, right?
Yeah. So Pooja, as someone who hasn't experienced HR in large organizations,
Mm-hmm.
in one sentence, what's the value you have seen till now from HR?
It doesn't have to be personally, it can be in general.
Yeah.
Personally, it would be great. Well, if you don't have a personally.
I mean, after all that you said, Debbie, now,
Yeah,
uh,
don't be
I
colored with
kind
that.
of it did cloud my mind a lot about the importance of HR, and I was parallelly thinking about what if we didn't have that HR person at the rate at which our company is growing, and I was leaning towards the yes of having somebody um, almost be an umbrella, uh, you know, person to help all of these different requirements. So again, personally, I'd saw. Unfortunately, Kiran, I don't have much to say, but and it is something that I do need to go back and think about after both of you. I also agree with you, Kiran, about it being still in its infancy, or even lesser than that. There is still a lot more um, that HR has to show, and somewhere maybe we need to start. And because there's so much resistance about hate and the hate towards HR, it's becoming even harder for HR to really shine in their own space. But uh, yeah, I think I'm still leaning towards the goodness of HR. I feel, and I think it is a necessary uh,
That's awesome. Obviously, most
organization.
companies, or almost every single company, then has to do a much better job in helping everyone understand the value of HR, right? And I think
Yeah,
it starts from that company perspective rather than individually, where the company has to showcase why HR is so important for the organization and not, just another function which just does crisis management to a large
true,
Absolutely.
extent.
true.
And maybe that's when employees will love HR and appreciate the work that's been done.
I think, and I think we're out of time, but to wrap it up, what we're coming to is HR does have a role. It's severely, severely misunderstood. And in a lot of companies, more companies, it will shock you to know how many companies are still pushing paper, right? HR is still, living in the dark ages, unfortunately. But that's not, I wouldn't say it's their doing entirely. It's because people have not understood the true value of what HR can bring to the table. So it's about empowerment through the right use of technology, empowerment through the right use of data, empowerment to actually speak up and be heard by leadership. Really, people,
Yeah,
founders, leaders are rarely experts on workplace issues and behavioral analytics. Truly, right? But HR is, so giving them that voice, and HR owning that voice as well, right?
Yeah.
I think that's happening a lot, where a lot of people, teams, people, leaders are finally, wearing that mantle well, and speaking up and, pushing for these changes that are required, so that we can all create a better, we can all make work a better place, right? Uh,
yeah.
so on that note, I think any other closing statements from anybody?
Yep.
No,
I
I
am
think
just off
um,
to thinking now.
Well, I think it's a great time to be in HR, honestly, because of the number of changes that are happening. So it's a
Yeah,
great time if you think you're being in HR, do it, because um, it's booming. It's there's so much you can do. There is so much scope for growth, and there's
yeah.
so much scope for making a true difference. I think that's what it is. So yeah, on that note, I'll bring this TTT to an end, and we will see you on the next one very soon. Goodbye.
Thank
uh,
you. Bye.